Hi everyone, and welcome to this evening's Lowdown chat. I'm here with my cousin, Carl Adams, who used to go to Windsor back in the day and who is now over in Bangladesh, or more specifically, Cox's Bazar. And so we're just going to be talking about development and a little bit about the refugee crisis, the Rohingya refugee crisis, around COVID-19 and how they're developing, how they're kind of dealing with that, and everything else. But I'll pass it over to you, Carl. Can you just introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about your family, your involvement at Windsor, what you're doing, how you got into it.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, Ethan, for that. I'll first of all just introduce my really bad internet connection. So if I do drop out from time to time, or there's a bit of a delay on the line, please just bear with me with that. Running off my phone for the internet. But I'm Carl, so I've been involved in Windsor Park through the youth group days, and then as a leader of a youth group. And then for the past, I'd say 9 years, I've been working first with Tearfund and now with Medair. And in the past 3 years of that, I've been overseas with this organization called Medair. And I've been based in Nepal and in Indonesia and now Bangladesh, and involved in emergency response. So that's earthquake response, tsunami response, and then now here responding to the world's largest refugee camp here, which is was almost on my doorstep. So it's a privilege to be here and come and speak with you guys here this evening for you, and really keen to have a bit of a chat.
Cool. Sounds good. And just so you know, there's probably about a 3-second delay. I think we've kind of figured out. Earlier on in the week, I messaged Carl and I said, hey, are you able to do the Lowdown interview that we talked about a few weeks back? And it took a couple of days to get back to me, which is quite unlike Carl. And when he did get back to me, he's like, oh, sorry, there was a big cyclone, so everything is kind of wiped out for a couple of days. So it shows how different our kind of worlds currently are. Our countries currently are. Carla, would you be able to kind of talk a little bit about what made you kind of get into the development sector in the first place, and where has it taken you so far?
Yeah. Well, I think what made me really interested was growing up and going through youth group and hearing about things like social justice, and also seeing things out there in the world on, why are things a certain way, and the fact that there's no easy solutions to why some people are born into struggle or hardship, while others of us are born into a lot of privilege and opportunity. What makes those differences, and how does that become not just something that's in our own generation, but that gets carried on to the next generation? I was really intrigued by these questions on, how do you give people a long and fulfilling life? How do you increase life expectancy in places where there are really poor health systems? How do you deal with conflicts between communities or between countries and resolve those? And these are all really tricky questions. And that's what led me down a path of study that there's no one single answer to that. But I studied things like history and international relations, and then went on to doing my master's looking at disaster response, looking at the ways that communities respond to their communities in disasters, how they try and get back on their feet with the support of aid agencies as well. So all of these kinds of questions have been going around in my head through my teenage years, and then set me on this path for my working life as well, to be working in some of these places around the world and trying to grapple with these challenges, on the ground.
So you were involved in Windsor growing up. I think you started going when you were about 13, and when you moved to the shore. And I remember, I think you went to a trip in maybe Cambodia with Rangitoto College or something like that. I think that was kind of part of the story there somewhere. But how has your faith helped you in your role, and how has it kind of helped, I guess, shape your worldview, and how you kind of see things? I know you see some of probably kind of the tragedies in life, but I'm sure you see some pretty beautiful things too. Yeah, are you able to kind of touch on that? How has your faith played a role in what you do?
Mm. Well, I smile when you first mentioned that, because my first entry to Windsor Park was actually I had moved to the shore when I just started college, and so I didn't know anyone going to Rangitoto College, and so my first day was a sea of blue uniforms, and didn't know anyone. And my mum was actually the one who pushed me to go along to Windsor Park because she heard that there's a really cool youth group, and so I went along, and that's how I got involved. So amazing, all these years later, how yeah, to still have that been such a thing that has really shaped me as a person. And what brings me here, and what I see is really interesting, is this: being in Bangladesh, it's a majority Muslim country. Around 85–90% of the population is Muslim, and Christians make up a tiny minority of 0.3%. So being in this kind of culture, I thought, how would faith come into the way of work? The organization I work for is based on Christian faith, and that's what inspires people who work for it to do the work that we do in different countries around the world. But I thought, how does this work on the ground? And a couple of months in, I got my first response to that. So we had a really sad situation where one of our staff members passed away. And our first response to that was people of all faiths in our office. We thought, we just came together, and the natural thing in that scenario was to pray. And we had this group of people standing around 40 people, Muslims, Christians, Hindus, and Buddhists. And the natural response to that was to come together in prayer. And so just seeing the role of faith, that becomes a normal thing as an organization, nothing weird despite coming from different faith perspectives, is something that I found really quite a surprise here. And coming from a faith perspective also enables you to connect with people on that level as well, even where there are differences. So, around, maybe in New Zealand, there are, faith, perhaps for many people, doesn't play such a role in day-to-day life. But somewhere like here, it's such a core part of people's everyday lives. We have the sound of the prayer speakers coming 5 times a day, and people, do stop their work for that each time that those happen. And in the moment, we're in the month of Ramadan, where people are fasting in their efforts to be closer in their faith. So, it's something that really inspires me, is that that's a space that we can speak into. That's a space that we can connect and communicate about, and share about, why we do what we do, what inspires us, what do we find important in life. And so those values, even when we come from different faiths, actually are something that binds and connects us and enables us to really speak on a different level than just what are we doing today in our day-to-day work.
I'm going to kind of spring this question sort of on kind of the same sort of kind of theme that you're just talking about. I kind of feel over here in New Zealand, and maybe in other Western countries, I'm not too sure. I can just kind of speak about New Zealand, but I kind of feel like we do this thing, and we like to be tolerant of other kind of belief systems and cultures. But really, our level of tolerance is actually just not talking about them. It's letting everyone kind of believe their own thing. We have those discussions, and we definitely wouldn't pray together, like kind of what you just talked about. How would you say that, in Bangladesh where you are, and other countries that you've been involved in, how do you see that playing out a little bit differently? Are they more public in the way that they express their faith? What could we learn from, I guess, these other cultures and the way they express their faith in God, or their many gods, or whatever it may be?
Yeah, I think I'd answer that in two parts. One is that we need to be sensitive. We're living in a diverse place here with different faiths coming together, and so there are some areas where of course there are differences and there are different ways of practicing faith, and so that's, you know, coming at that from a perspective of tolerance and respect. That's the first step that we try and do here. But the other part is that just, you know, when we come together, I think it's become such a normal thing here that it would be unusual for faith not to feature in people's day-to-day lives. So, you know, really common thing every day in the office or every other day is for someone to say, you know, my father's sick, my uncle's sick, my sister's got exams. Can you pray for me? And it seems a little bit of a no-brainer. And so I feel sometimes a little bit of a disconnect with New Zealand in that sense, because it doesn't seem weird here. That is just a normal part of being. Yeah, of course, there's probably so many different levels to it, and maybe I'm just scratching the surface, but I think that is a unique area that I wasn't really expecting.
Yeah, that's awesome. Are you able to share a little bit more about what you enjoy working in the humanitarian sector, but also some of the difficult things? I had this guy in my last church who worked with different government organizations in countries around the world, in developing countries. And, you know, he would just have story after story about the complexities that he works with, but also some of the amazing things that are happening around the world that we just wouldn't hear about here in New Zealand. And they just, yeah, it's a totally different way of operating. Are you able to share any kind of examples like that? Are you still there, mate? Oh, we may have lost you. I think we're just having technical difficulties, everyone. I'm just going to try to bring him back in a sec. He should be all right. It's just that where he is, it's a bit of touch and go. Okay, he's just coming back in now, so hopefully he can reconnect and we'll be all right. While you're waiting, why don't you think up a bit of a question that you have that you can ask Carl when he comes back in? I've got a whole lot of different ones, and soon we're going to be getting in and talking about the Rohingya refugee crisis specifically. We'll also be talking about how COVID-19 is having a whole lot of impacts on that. One of the things that I've read a lot about and seen videos on is just the fact that a lot of the things that we've done in New Zealand, things like social distancing, things just like the lockdown, staying in your houses, a lot of those things can't be done in these other developing nations. And so Carl's going to kind of explain how that actually works and some of the things that we can kind of pray for and think about. And hopefully later on in the discussion, we can go and we can get to some of the practical responses that we can actually do. And obviously, giving money is one of those things. Praying is one of those things, but hopefully he will have a couple of other answers for us as well. I think he's back on, so we'll see.
Hey,
Are you
sorry
back
about
with
that.
us, mate? Are you
Yeah,
right? Oh, don't worry, mate.
Yeah, I think I caught the most of your questions, so I can jump straight into that if you like.
Jump straight into it, mate.
Okay. So yeah, there's a lot of things which I enjoy about this work, and it's definitely dynamic. That's one way I could put it. Both encouraging and can be incredibly frustrating as well. What really inspires me is that you know, every day whenever I'm going out and meeting the people that we work with, I'm really inspired by the sorts of difficulties that they've gone through. Here we're working with refugees who have fled for their lives from their homeland to take up refuge, to take up safety in a place that is not their home, and to meet these kinds of people and just to hear their incredibly rich stories of what they've been through, but also the fact that they don't let that get them down. You know, I couldn't imagine even surviving through something like so many of them have experienced, but that they see they try and find a hope for the future. They try and find ways of, making the best of a really difficult situation. There's stories among refugees about just how, they have moved into a refugee camp setting, but they still want to have that sense of community that they had back in their home villages. So they, live in the same area. They try and start those same community structures, the sort of the groups where women get together, the places where children hang out and play sports together. And so they're doing that within such a constrained environment, but they find ways to get by and try and encourage each other and support one another. So I think that strength of resilience is something that, every time I see it, I learn a lesson from it. Maybe flipping to the challenges as well is, in a time like now, we're coming into, we're quite delayed in receiving, but having COVID here in Bangladesh. But now as a country, there's 32,000 cases, and we've had a delayed number of them entering in the refugee camps, but we're now starting to get these cases in the camps. And, this also, we're in such a resource poor environment. There are not going to be enough hospital beds, for example. There are clearly not enough ventilators or oxygen for the possible number of cases here. So the real challenging part is for those staff who are on the front lines, the people like the doctors and the nurses who are having to make really life and death decisions around who gets admitted to the hospital and gets a bed and who gets turned away. If there are two people in need of a ventilator, who gets the ventilator and who gets, the best care that they can get without that kind of equipment. So that's the really harsh, cold side of some of the decision, because ultimately, when resources are so limited, decisions have to be made on who gets those resources and how are they allocated. Does everyone get a little bit, or there's a focus on the people who are the most vulnerable to be able to support them during this time? So that's definitely a challenge that we all grapple with. And I was talking with my team members here and trying to find, where do we find ourselves within this equation? And the verse in Micah 6 verse 8 comes up. What are we called to do in this situation? We're thinking and really grappling with each other. Should we be doing this, or should we be doing that, or should we be assisting in this way? And that can carry a heavy weight on any of our team members. And as the team leader, I really don't want to push that onto our staff to feel like they have the weight of responsibility of the world on their shoulders. But that verse in Micah says, we're called to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. And I think to center ourselves in that, so many things flow out from that. So many ways of working flow out from that, but also it helps to relieve some of that weight that we may feel, that we have to control all of this, that everything is on our shoulders. But ultimately, to give that over and to know that we can do what we can do, but ultimately the way that we act it means far more than the things that we are doing and trying to do by our own strength. By looking towards faith and having that kind of peace of spirit, that can also inspire and motivate us and give us the strength that we need to take those tough decisions.
Yeah, that's cool. And I love that verse, Carl, that Micah 6:8. When I was doing youth work in schools and for 24/7 youth work, that was kind of their motto, is Micah 6:8, that whole, justice, mercy, and humility. So yeah, that's such a great verse to kind of live by and walk by. Can you briefly explain the Rohingya refugee crisis? I know that it's a very complex situation, but if you could kind of sum it up in about 3 minutes, I don't know if you're able to do that, but if you could, that would be awesome. And if anyone can do it, I'm sure it'll be you. So are you able to do that for us?
Sure, I'm a guy of many words, but I'll give it a shot. So
Runs in the family,
The
mate.
the Rohingya are a people group who their home is in Myanmar, and they've lived there for centuries, for generations, and they feel a lot of attachment and identity to the place, to the land, and the environment and their homes where they've grown up. And since the 1970s in particular, they've faced a lot of persecution and discrimination inside Myanmar by people there and also by the authorities. And so this has gone through various stages. They had originally had citizenship, and then they had their citizenship stripped away, and increasingly have been treated as illegal people there, and that they're not one of the ethnic groups recognized within the country of Myanmar. So there's been different flare-ups of violence that's happened over the years, and because they come from the area which borders Bangladesh, they've crossed over the border in different waves, different groups of people, on different occasions throughout the past 30, 40 years. But this all came to a real head in August 2017, where there was conflict between some rebel groups among the Rohingya and with the authorities, the border guard in Myanmar. And that sparked a huge backlash where systematically the Rohingya people were driven from their homes, their villages were burnt, and there's just horrific stories of women and men and children being attacked. There's numbers on children being thrown into fires alive. So just horrific types of violence that I can't even begin to imagine. Rohingya that I've met here, have injuries that they've sustained being shot or being attacked. And so the kinds of violence which they suffered was awful, and that drove them from their homes. Many walked for even weeks without food, without shelter. They didn't know where they were going. I talked to one of our volunteers who now works with us. His name's Abdul, and he and his family walked for 2 weeks to get to Bangladesh. He said that the first story, he was in his home, and it was the Friday morning, and so it's the weekend, and typical teenager, he was 17 years old at the time, he was enjoying a nice sleep in on a Friday morning, which is the weekend here. And then he heard a bit of commotion happening and people starting to come into the village, and so his parents, got him out of bed, maybe there's visitors from the neighbors coming along. But then it wasn't a usual kind of visitors. There was just a panicked sense of people arriving into the village, and they said that their village had been attacked. Their village, the next village over. So they all got together their things and left the village and ran. And he didn't know where he was going to. He was just following the sea of people, the flow of people. And so they just kept walking, following all the others. And it took 2 weeks, and they reached a river which bordered Bangladesh and Myanmar. And on one side of the river where they were coming from, they were being pursued. They were being chased by people who thought that they didn't belong there. And on the other side of the river was Bangladesh. And there were the border guard, the police, and local villagers in Bangladesh, seeing these people who had lost everything, were in a state of starving and with really nothing, trying to cross a river, trying to swim even if they didn't know how to swim, trying to thatch together banana trees and bamboo and just make their way across. Some were even trying to cross with their cows swimming across the river. And so they were helped to safety on the Bangladesh side of the border. And essentially they arrived to what was a jungle. This is a borderland. This is where there is really not a lot. And so they were in this national park and had to make way for and eke out a living, a survival. So the people here in Bangladesh really provided them they were the first responders with food and water and providing what little they could. And then, now we are, the world's largest refugee camp has been carved out of what was jungle. We have shelters as far as the eye can see, made of bamboo with a tarpaulin roof. And it's just, it's an incredible sight, but also a really sad one that people can see from the place where I live. I can look from the rooftop across and see Myanmar, see the place where people call home. but yet they can't go there. They fear the violence of them returning, and live in such difficult living environment where they are entirely dependent on aid because they're confined to such a small place with no livelihood opportunities. And so their hopes to return home seem so distant at the moment. And especially now we have a virus coming into the camps. It's a camp where the population density is 30 times that of Auckland. So can you just imagine, people living literally on top of each other? There is just no space between a person and their neighbors. To use the toilet, they have to go outside to use a shared toilet, maybe with 10, 20 families. They need to use a water pump to get the water that they need for their home. So to stay at home, to take those same messages that we have been able to do so well in New Zealand, stay at home, social distance or physical distance from one another, that's just not possible in the camps. And so there's a real fear that this virus will just run rampant when it enters the camps. And it's just over a week ago that the first cases did start in the camps. And now we're sitting on about 23 cases in the camps. But, tracking down those people and their contacts is proving a really challenging task.
Mm. So kind of what's the approach that Bangladesh, well, I guess Bangladesh and Medair organizations like the one you're working in, how is it actually coping with kind of stopping the spread or trying to slow it down? Because, yeah, like you just said, you can't really do what we're doing over in New Zealand. It's just totally different.
Yeah.
So what can you guys do?
Yeah, so Bangladesh as a country has been under lockdown since about the same time as New Zealand entered lockdown, so the 26th of March. So we're coming up to 2 months of lockdown, and that creates an incredible strain on a country like Bangladesh, which is pretty resource poor. There are a lot of people who live hand to mouth. They're day laborers, they're farmers. And so, and maybe in rural areas like maybe in New Zealand, if you're a farmer, you might still be able to be out on the land during a lockdown. But for all those people that work on construction sites, that make a living by riding a bicycle taxi, who, sell food in the market, and are just making ends meet day by day, it's an incredible strain to be able to stay at home for this length of time. So, credit to Bangladesh for doing the best that they can to lock down and keep people at home. But it does create a huge pressure on the economy and on ultimately an economy as individuals and families trying to make ends meet. The area where we are, this is Cox's Bazar, and where the camps are, that lockdown has even been stricter because there's this understanding that when the virus reaches here, it will be very difficult to stop it moving to the camps. And when it reaches the camps, incredibly tough to stop it. So there, since the end of March, we've been cut back to from all the regular activities back to essential activities, and then even to critical activities. So some of the things which are critical at the moment is basically healthcare, providing food, and managing waste. Come to think of, like, it's a city of over 1 million people. All of the regular services that you have in a city, in some form or another, have to be managed. And so during a lockdown, waste still needs to be managed so that you avoid the spread of disease. People still need to eat and have food, and healthcare is such an important essential activity. But there's so much more that makes life worth living and that protects people and ensures their safety. So things like improving shelters before we hit a really bad cyclone and monsoon season, where such temporary vulnerable shelters made of bamboo, we face the next few months of in a really tricky situation of, will they sustain, or will people will those be shelters which fall down and put at risk the people living in them? How about people who face some challenges of, or horrors of domestic violence or tension and conflict in the community, what kinds of services and support can they get during a time like this? So there are what are very essential services that have been pared back and that do put people at a further risk. So it's this real balancing of people are already suffering a crisis and they're faced with another crisis. So how do we deal with the refugee crisis while also dealing with a public health crisis as well? So these are some of the tricky balances that we're trying to work out here on the front lines of the response. But they're not easy questions, and that's some of the complexity that we try and work in a day-to-day here.
Well, it seems like there's a whole lot of going on currently, and probably always going on, really. Are you able to tell us just a little bit more about your role specifically and kind of how that works out? From my understanding, you're not necessarily like walking through the camps and doing kind of hands-on sort of stuff. You're managing, and you've got different projects and stuff on the go. Can you just explain what your role is kind of like for anyone that's kind of considering development and humanitarian work is something to consider going into?
Yeah. So, coming into this response close to 3 years ago, when it started off, it's often a team of people who have experience in other countries. So they're international, but from all around the world, who come together and start building up the team and building up a response. And that response, in the beginning has more expats and people who train in what are the kinds of ways of doing things and how do we scale up in an emergency, recruit a team. But really then that moves pretty quickly onto being locally led. So most of our staff are Bangladeshi. Most of our volunteers are Rohingya working in the camps. And we have a very small expat team. So at the moment, we're a team of about 160 Bangladeshi staff, and we have around 240 Rohingya volunteers who are working and supporting their own communities. And so we're 5 expats here on the team. So I'm the country director of our program here, and we have a number of other people, be that for communications and advocacy, where they reach out to our international audiences, helping to get the word out there about what the Rohingya are going through and what we are doing here in our work. We have people who are specialists in logistics, and that's, making sure that we get all the materials that we need to be able to support our program and get them out there in the right quality and quantities that we need. We also have people with specialization in nutrition and emergency response. A country like this hasn't had large-scale refugee camps where you need to really, look at the nutrition status of children and what they need to be able to be healthy and be able to support those who are malnourished through that really critical phase so it doesn't stunt their growth. And so that we have these different roles within the team, which most of them end up being Bangladeshi staff, and we bring in some of the technical expertise for areas where we really want to train up those who are in the program. So my role on the day-to-day looks far more like attending a lot of meetings, coordination with other aid agencies, with the United Nations who support a lot of our work here, and with the different government people. We are here on Bangladeshi soil. So of course the government wants to know what we are doing, how we are doing it, how we work and manage some of the relationships between a group of refugees and the Bangladeshi community, which they are living in as well. I also do a lot of linking up with different donors around the world who support our work and try and advocate for some of the things some of the needs which we see in the camps, which we think that there needs to be more focus on or attention given to those. So within this area of work, though, there's so many different roles that people can be involved in. For me, I'm more of a generalist and involved in the management side of overseeing the team that we have here. But anything from areas of like nursing or engineering or finance, these are all kinds of skill sets which people can bring in a field setting like I'm in here. But there's also so many other areas that people get involved in. For example, a lot of agencies which are in New Zealand, they have very strong fundraising activities, also educating and raising awareness within the New Zealand public on some issues which are happening in the world. There are human rights agencies like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch who are monitoring what is happening in the situation here, how are human rights being respected or not, and advocating for those kinds of things. So there's so many different pathways into this sector. And I would say, you know, my advice for people being really interested in it is that you know, work happens overseas, but it also happens in New Zealand. There are so many good organizations, be that the Red Cross or community groups or NGOs working to support vulnerable New Zealanders. So those are also really essential as well. Then there's these two elements, these you know, people working overseas, but people also working to support that effort in New Zealand. So a lot of different ways that people can take career options or opportunities to work within this sector. And that's where I've had opportunities also with Tearfund, first of all, in New Zealand, and then with Medair, which is a Christian Swiss-based organization working around a lot of conflict, war zones, and natural disasters in the world.
Awesome, thanks for that. That's a good answer. It's just on that, final advice, if someone is interested in going on, where should they start? Like, what's the starting point? Do they go study? Do they just ring up an organization like Tearfund and say, hey, I really want to help in some way? What's the best way to go?
Well, there's so many different ways, depending on the type of interest and organization that people are looking for. There's great ways to get engaged with volunteering. You know, my first involvement in this sector was I started interning at Tearfund as a volunteer, and being able to link up and learn from the people that they have there who have expertise in working in many of these countries around the world. And so just firstly trying to learn things. Maybe it's also the subject area of choice. You know, for me, I study different things relating to you know, a lot of different things on history of how some countries came to be in the situation they're in health. You know, what are some of the public health emergencies around the world, and how those countries are responding to it. So that's the area that I took my interest in. But equally, people come from an engineering perspective on how do you be a civil engineer in a really low resource setting where things get done a lot more with locally available materials. Really cool innovations which people are doing here. One that we are working on at the moment is, you know, we've got a refugee camp which is using huge numbers of tarpaulins to cover the shelters that people are living in. But what happens with those tarpaulins when they wear out and need to be disposed of? We're now looking at how do you create a biodegradable tarpaulin option, which will last a couple of years, but then won't become a burden to the environment when it needs to be disposed of. So there's so many different angles, be it from a more technical perspective or a more social and community-based perspective that people can get involved. And New Zealand's a hugely agricultural-based country, and so, you know, more in the development setting, people who are involved with rural livelihoods and agriculture can bring a lot of value in that space. And I know that that's something that Tearfund has done a lot with, working with dairy farmers in Sri Lanka, for example, to work to improve the way that dairy farmers do their dairying and how they can earn a better income from the work that they do. So a lot of different opportunities. If anyone wants to reach out to me directly, then yeah, more than happy to speak with you and link with different people. But the organization I work for, Medair, also takes new relief workers. So these are people who might have studied or have an area of expertise that they really want to explore, but haven't worked specifically in this kind of environment. And so it gives an opportunity to get a foot in the door by working for a year in a role where you're able to sort of shadow and work within a team and learn how things are being done before taking the next step into more senior roles where you can lead a project or support with responding in a particular area, be that like health or nutrition, or shelter, or water and sanitation.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Carl. That's really helpful and very practical as well. One of the things that I kind of get amazed about with the whole development sector is that it is so vast. I used to always think, oh, there's very limited kind of people that were needed. But, even just recently I've been reading and things like, agriculture and how important that is, and engineering. And then there's things like education, hospitals and doctors and nurses. Like, they need society just like we do, and so like wherever we can kind of input into that, yeah, that's awesome. Kind of related to that, a little bit different, is what are the fundamental needs of every nation, but in particular every developing nation? What are the kind of, if a country could get these things sorted, might be education, I don't know, sanitary, yeah, you know better than me.
You're asking me the tough questions, but this is a really interesting one.
Always.
To try and draw it down to a couple of things. I think one of the reasons that places face difficulties, and that development is such a journey, is because there is no single solution. Otherwise it would have been done. If it was easy, it would have been sorted already. But if I try and really drive down to what maybe I see as a few major steps, is that the first one being, when countries are at war and there is a lot of tension, or be that within a country a civil war, it becomes really difficult to do very much at all. People are being killed by conflict, and so how to respond to that is first of all, peace building is such a key activity between communities and between countries. Sorry, in the background you're probably hearing the call to prayer, so I hope that's not too loud. Excuse me, moving on from, when countries are at peace, that's already a huge step in other things being able to happen, having stability to be able to improve in other areas. And things like immunization, reducing preventable diseases, the spread of those, and improving basic living conditions, and primary education, those play a huge role in a next step to getting people to live longer and more fulfilling lives. And then moving beyond that, which is the challenge which many countries are starting to enter into, is when when preventable loss of life is prevented, then we move on to some of the more challenging things on how do you move from primary healthcare to some of the more advanced systems. How do you move from building a healthcare system rather than just a health clinic which treats basically first aid or very basic level care? How do you move from primary education to building universities that really educate the population into the roles which are needed now and in the future? How do you build strong and accountable government? How do you build a tax base for the country to be able to support all of these services, which are supposed to take care of the most vulnerable people? So those are some of the more challenging things, which I think countries at all levels, New Zealand grapples with many of these things, how to improve these areas, but many developing countries end up, being quite, it is a very big challenge because, you want to do all of these things at once and bring the best for the people. But it's always a balancing act and trying to negotiate what takes priority. And then many countries like Bangladesh also face more than their fair share of natural or human disasters. To speak to Bangladesh specifically, Bangladesh is a very low-lying country, which is prone to cyclones and extreme levels of flooding. It's a population of 170 million people living in a very small place. So the density is really, people are living very close together. And when something like a cyclone happens, like you mentioned, that happened earlier last week, the country had to evacuate 2.3 million people to a safer location. And this is at a time when we're trying to prevent the spread of COVID. So how do people be relocated to a different area and then move back to their homes and balance all of these things? How does a country that is already very resource poor host over 1 million refugees in its territory and provide the support that's needed to them? So there are things which countries that are developing and trying to move and improve their systems on a number of different levels do end up facing a disproportionate share of burdens as well, and difficulties and challenges. And so while they try and do their best to support the needs of their people and of refugees that they're trying to support, it's no easy task. And I think that's where the rest of the world can also come in and trying to backstop those efforts, to support them in doing the work that they're doing, and to also provide the kinds of support which may be needed, if that's on a technical level, if it's financial resources, or if it's also helping to share some of the load which countries are carrying.
Yeah, that sounds complex, mate. It sounds really complex, but it's good. It also makes me think about where we're currently at as a nation here in New Zealand, and I guess other developed nations around the world. And I think we often think, oh, our government could do this better and this better, and whatever it may be. But we're so blessed. We're so blessed to live in the country that we do. And I think it's a real challenge to us, actually, of how can we help in these different ways. And you kind of touched on it before, but what would be some simple things? If you don't want to make this your kind of like life mission, and I know a lot of people won't, but they do want to kind of help in the ways that they can. Other than just giving money and prayer, are there anything else? Is there anything else that we can do that would actually help in any way, or is that kind of like, if you just need to get stuck in? What would your advice be there?
Yeah, well, there are a number of areas that I think it's really important that people do engage with. The most recent thing of talking with different people and hearing that they are praying for Bangladesh and for the situation faced by the refugees, to take that message back to my team, who are doctors and nurses and paramedics working on the front lines here of this response, and for them to know that people halfway around the world are backing them, are supporting them in prayer, and care about the work that they are doing. That's incredibly powerful and motivating for them. So I'd say that's a really key thing. Supporting aid agencies also financially plays a big role. The really great thing about this response so far is that we haven't had to wait until it's got really bad before we're able to begin our work. People often, when things hit the media, that's when donations come into aid agencies. But often when it's needed is before it's in the media and when it's in the media, not a couple of months later. So when people are able to support on an ongoing basis aid agencies who are preparing and responding, that plays a really key role as well. Because unfortunately, when things are out of the media spotlight, they lose our focus and attention, and that's normal. But these issues don't go away overnight, and this was already a crisis before. It will continue to be, and after COVID, it will remain a crisis. Other ways that people can get involved in are by engaging. Maybe that's through working for an agency that's responding, but also through raising awareness of the different types of issues that are faced by refugees. There are so many different touch points, be that refugees in New Zealand who are being resettled and trying to find a new place in their new communities and the place that they now call home, to people who want to learn more about what are some of the challenges that are faced in disaster responses, or faced by refugees, or how do you bring peace and peace building efforts. And so there's so many areas, be that universities and the ways that they do research, or also human rights organizations who want to get their message out there and raise awareness with governments to add a bit of a weight of support behind the efforts which they're trying to do. So a lot of different fronts which people can get involved in. And I think the more that we become aware of what people are facing around the world, the more that makes us connected as a global community. You know, often when there's difficulty or hardship, it's so easy for us to turn inward, and we've seen some of that around the world. When when people feel threatened or they feel uncertain about the future, they turn inwards, be that to their own country, but even more to their own community or their own household, and that can shut us off from the world and the people that are around us. But to resist that temptation and to actually have the confidence to look outward during a time that's already difficult for many of us, and to see those that are beyond our doorstep. That plays a big role in who we are as people. That we aren't only supportive of others in the times when things are going well for us, but that we're able to continue caring, and that our care extends beyond our own households, also in times of difficulty as well.
Cool. Cheers, mate. I'm going to finish off with one final question, and that is, do you have any final words of wisdom for us? And this can be related to development, humanitarian, social justice, or it could just be general life words of wisdom. The reason why I always ask it is because sometimes you just get nuggets of gold. And yeah, I'd love to hear a nugget of gold from you, Carl.
I've really been dwelling on what are some of the things that to sort of give us a sense of direction or hope during a time that, to be honest, can sometimes feel quite hopeless. And where is our sense of direction in all of this? Where is the hope for where things are going next? Or where is the certainty that we can look to and hold on to? And once again, I think this is the amazing part of living in community and coming together. And my community here of my bubble exists of 3 people, so it's pretty confined here. But sitting down and discussing with others, and it brings me to the book of Habakkuk, Old Testament, is something that maybe we don't often look into, and it's Habakkuk questioning, why is there all this bad things happening in the world? What is where is the greater plan in all of this? How does it all fit together? And it's so unfair. Where is justice? Where is righteousness in all of this? And that's something that I feel that many of us can resonate with at the moment. This kind of where is the direction? Where is God within all of this struggle and hardship? And then also it turns to God's responding to this and saying, yes, there is a dark and chaotic world, but he invites us into a journey of faith while he's in this process of reconciling the world to himself, where he's going about to defeat evil in the world, going about to bring justice to all people, and working to rescue the oppressed and the innocent. So even when the world feels like it's falling apart, being able to have that trust and that joy in the promises that are given, I think that is something that is a source that we can hold on to during a time that's really quite confusing. And I don't think any of us, even the greatest of leaders or religious scholars, can really give us a sense of why certain things happen at the moment. But that's something that we can draw near to and hold on to during a time that is quite confusing and difficult, and can be uncertain for many of us.
Yeah, cheers, Carl. Thank you so much for that. Where have you gone? You're still there? There you are.
I'm there? Okay.
Yeah. I just wanted to say that, first of all, that passage, I have heard it quoted 3 times this week. One in an article by young adults. Another person in our church was talking to me about something during the week, and they mentioned Habakkuk, that whole story, and now you tonight. So I kind of feel like when God speaks, he speaks to multiple people at the same time about the same thing. And so that's really cool. And your videos just come right. It's come really well too. So that's right at the end. Anyway, at least we could hear you. Hey mate, it was great having you. I have so much respect for you. You're an incredible man. I love you as a cousin, and you're going places, And I think you're one of the people in my life that I know is going to go a very long way. I'm very excited to see where your future heads. So I'm just going to finish by praying for you, and the situation that you're currently in, and that God gives you wisdom and discernment in that, if that's all right.
Yeah, thanks.
Cool. Let's pray. Father, Lord, I just thank you for Carl, and I thank you for the amazing journey that you have brought him on. Lord, for his faith journey, for his development, humanitarian work journey, and for where he is now. Lord, I just pray that that you guide him, that you give him wisdom and discernment as he continues to work in a really tough situation. And Lord, I just pray that you have your hand over the people, and not just the Rohingya refugee crisis, but not just the refugee camps, but right throughout Bangladesh, Lord. I pray that they can get enough aid. Lord, I pray that COVID-19 can be managed really well. Lord, that we can find, I guess, a cure for this as soon as we can. So yeah, just guide Carl in that, be with him and be with everyone else that he works with and yeah, I guess cares for. We pray that this in your name, Jesus. Amen. Awesome. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on the Lowdown, where we chat about things that matter. And again, thanks, Carl, for joining us. Have a great night, and you can join us on Zoom on the Young Adults page. If you're not a young adult, well, you just talk about it with some other people, and make sure that yeah, you do what you can to help out those who are in need the most. Over and out. See you guys.
Thank you.